In today's episode of Psych Cinema, we're going to be tackling Spider-Man Far From Home. We're going to explore three specific areas of psychology. We're going to look at how the blip and the 5-year lapse of time in the film represents the displacement that modern teens face in today's era of growing up. We're going to look at stages of development and how normal teenagers are really kind of figuring out identity versus role confusion. And then we're finally going to wrap it up by exploring this new concept in psychology known as emerging adulthood. I'm Jonathan Hetterly, a licensed professional counselor, and this is Psych Cinema. Psych Cinema is Shrink Tank's video series where I explore the psychology found in the films that I watch and love. Before we get started, do me a favor, subscribe and click on the notification bell. That way you won't miss out anytime we drop new content that explores the rich intersection of psychology and pop culture. In another video, I did my review of Spider-Man Far From Home. You can check that out. It's linked in the description. But today I really want to focus on the psychology of the film. And let's first dive into this concept of the blip and displacement of modern teenage life. So for those of you that have seen the Avenger films and have seen Spider-Man Far From Home, you know that 5 years time has passed from when Thanos had the snap to when Tony Stark reversed it, Iron Man reversed it. And so now you have this high school setting where Peter Parker resides, and half of the kids have continued to grow and mature while the other half immediately show up 5 years later, but haven't grown or matured during those 5 years of time. And that really represents this sort of disorientation of kind of stages of development in teenage life. And we know this is kind of true with what a lot of teenagers are facing in modern times. As someone that works with young adults, I constantly hear from them and even from their parents about how things were done during their time when they were growing up in teenagers or stepping into young adulthood. And we just know life is not the same anymore. We know that today's parents or grandparents, the metrics for going to college was vastly different. It was equally valid to not go to college and just jump into the workforce and be able to find a career and a viable income to raise a family with. We know today that's not necessarily the case. We also know that when people are getting married and when people are having kids has drastically changed. So for older generations to kind of impart that standard or that timeline with today's kids, that really can be very confusing and hard to measure up when so many of today's metrics are vastly different. And so even though the film kind of takes a more lighthearted approach to that, you can't escape the fact that half of Peter Parker's peers have continued to grow up, and some kids that were 5 years younger than him are now in his class. And the film kind of playfully addresses that, even though it's not a big thing. But I do think that a lot of teenagers and young adults can resonate with that idea of how time passes and how things start getting really disrupted. But now let's talk about this idea of stages of development. And I want to specifically talk about Erik Erikson. He created these 8 stages of development, and the 5th stage is really what happens during adolescent and teenage years, right around from age 12 to 18. And what Erik Erikson identified in this stage of development, it was the 5th stage, was this tension between figuring out your identity versus role confusion. You know, taking in all of your life experiences and helping it shape like what's going to be your identity and role moving forward into adulthood. And that would really be to where you start to differentiate from your maybe religious upbringing, or maybe what your parents want or aspire for you to be when you grow up, whether you want to go to college, whether you want to go in the military, whether you want to go in a career like being a lawyer or a doctor, or if you want to find a trade that really is more blue collar. And that's really what Erik Erikson looked at with that stage of development, that 5th stage. And we see that played out with Peter Parker and how he's trying to figure out these roles and his identity as a high school teen from New York, as well as Spider-Man, who at the beginning of Homecoming longed to be a part of the Avengers and really wanted to take on the mantle of a superhero responsibility. But here in Far From Home, after the events of the blip and the snap, he's really looking just to kind of have a little downtime and connect with his peers and pursue the girl that he's developing strong romantic feelings for. So again, it's kind of wrestling between this identity versus your role and how that plays out. So now that I've talked about Erik Erikson's stages of development, I want to introduce this concept of emerging adulthood. And it was a concept that was introduced by the psychologist Jeffrey Jensen Arnett in the early 2000s, where he started to recognize there seems to be this new stage that people are going through that sits in between traditional adolescence and adulthood. Because here's what we know, what's going on in our culture, is childhood is ending sooner. Kids are starting puberty much earlier, and some of that can be through diet, evolution, or even just simply stress, the amount of stress that younger people are going through that starts to shape their brains and transition them into puberty and mental emotional displacement. So childhood's ending earlier, but we know adulthood is happening later. People are graduating college later. People are getting married later. People are having kids later. They're having less kids. They're becoming financially independent later. Recently, there was a survey that went out in the American public, and they identified the age of 28 as the age when people would start to be embarrassed if they were still living at home and being dependent financially with their parents.
The meatloaf!
And so again, we see some of that traditional timeline of adulthood moving, and you have all this extra space and time in between. And that's really where Arnett suggested emerging adulthood happened. Whereas in Erikson's stage of development, we talked about how it was role, confusion versus identity. Once you move out of that phase and you kind of have a sense of your identity and the role that you hope to take as an adult, emerging adulthood really happens between ages 18 and 25. And the tension in that is figuring out responsibility versus diversion. And that's what we're seeing with a lot of young adults. It's like they have these responsibilities to step into, but they're increasingly becoming distracted and kind of pushing off responsibility of adulthood, whether it be financial independence, whether it be completing college, whether it be stepping into full-time jobs, living outside of their parents' home. And so that's really also what we're seeing a little bit with Peter Parker, is he wanted to become a superhero. He wanted to become an Avenger, and now he has that, and what do we see? Instead of taking on that responsibility that comes with being a superhero and really stepping up whenever there's a time of great danger or threat, he really just wants a vacation. He wants to pass it off on other people to take care of the threats and the ills of the world so that he can come up with the perfect scenario where he can confess his feelings to MJ. So that idea of diversion, the idea of what you want or fun, or just personal self-interest getting in the way of taking on responsibility. And it doesn't make Peter Parker a bad person, no more than it makes any young adult that's struggling between taking on adult responsibilities and enjoying this age of and phase of life, where we hear a lot of that with college students, right? College-age kids that like, this is supposed to be the best time of your life, the most fun. But at the same time, that's really where you're supposed to solidify responsibility, independence, autonomy, and that's what Peter Parker is struggling with, as he has to accept that having that identity of Spider-Man is a responsibility, and being a superhero, being a part of the Avengers, isn't necessarily a part-time gig, or you don't function as needed, like on call. It really is something that is at your core identity and responsibility. And I think this movie does a really good job of highlighting that tension for Spider-Man. And in previous Spider-Man movies, especially with the Tobey Maguire version, he was already in college and he was already kind of struggling. Do I want to just be a normal college student, or do I really want to take on the mantle of a superhero? Where again, with Tom Holland as a high schooler, we see this happening at a younger age, and just physically he represents and looks like a teenager, so you can see and you can empathize with that struggle. It's not like Tony Stark, it's not like Captain America, a fully fledged adult wrestling with this responsibility. It's a teenager, it's a kid, and I think that continues to anchor Spider-Man as a very relatable superhero. But I'm curious what you guys thought, because obviously this film is pretty lighthearted and charming and fun, but I'm really talking about some very serious challenges that today's teenagers face. And I'm curious, did you pick up on some of those metaphors and themes in the film? Do you think that the struggle that Peter Parker is facing is real and it's relatable to today's young adults? Or do you think that I'm making too big of a thing and we really need to look at today's teens as kids these days as just kind of more unmotivated or undisciplined, and that they really need to grow up sooner than our society seems to be encouraging them to do so? Be sure to leave me your comments below. You can also recommend a film that you'd like for me to dissect here on Psych Cinema. Be sure to check out shrinktank.com. You can follow me on Twitter. You're going to find all types of videos, articles, podcasts, and more where we explore the rich intersection of pop culture and psychology. That's going to do it for today's episode of Psych Cinema. Thank you for watching. I'm Jonathan Hetterly. Until next time, I'll see you at the movies.